My name is Dorothy Lane. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my life, I've occupied a very specific kind of space. The kind that's useful, quiet, and rarely questioned. I'm the person people rely on without really noticing. The one who fills in gaps, smooths transitions, remembers details others forget. I've built a life around being dependable, not impressive, calm, not commanding. If you asked people who know me, my family especially, they'd probably say I'm steady, practical, easy. I've heard that word more times than I can count. Easy to get along with, easy to overlook, easy to assume that she will be fine no matter what's asked of her. I don't correct them when they say it. I used to think that being low friction meant being mature, that staying quiet meant staying kind. This story isn't about me suddenly finding my voice in a dramatic way. It's not about exposing secrets or humiliating anyone. There's no shouting, no public reckoning, no moment where everyone freezes and finally sees me clearly. That kind of justice makes good headlines, but it rarely reflects real life. What happened to me unfolded slowly, almost politely. It centers around my grandmother's birthday party, a family event meant to celebrate a woman who held us all together. Instead, it became another moment where my sister took all the glory, the praise, the stories, the spotlight that somehow always found her, even when the work, the care, and the quiet effort had come from somewhere else. If you'd been there, you might not have noticed anything unusual. I didn't protest. I didn't interrupt. I didn't look upset. I played my role well. I always had. To everyone else, it probably looked like harmony. But harmony can be misleading when it's built on omission. This isn't a story about a single slight or one unfair moment. It's about accumulation, about what happens when your contributions are absorbed into the background long enough that people stop seeing them as coming from you at all. When your silence becomes expected, when your restraint is mistaken for a lack of depth. And it's about what happens next, not when you lash out, but when you stop shrinking. The truth didn't need attention, just space to exist. I didn't demand recognition. I didn't confront anyone at the party. I didn't correct the narrative out loud. What I did instead was quieter, slower, and ultimately irreversible. I let people encounter reality without my interference. I stopped buffering discomfort. I stopped translating myself into something more palatable. Over time, that absence spoke more clearly than any argument could have. I'm sharing this story now not to position myself as a victim, and not to cast anyone else as a villain. People are rarely that simple. I'm sharing it because there's a particular kind of invisibility that many of us learn to live with, and because stepping out of it doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like doing nothing at all and letting the truth stand on its own. So before we go further, I want to ask you something, quietly, honestly. Have you ever realized that people only valued the version of you that asked for nothing and never noticed what it cost you to be that way? To understand what happened later, you have to understand who I already was to my family long before my grandmother's birthday party. I wasn't the dramatic one. That was my sister. She had a way of entering rooms like something had just started because she arrived. People adjusted their posture when she spoke. They leaned in. They laughed louder. She didn't demand attention. She assumed it. And somehow, that made everyone else cooperate. I was different. I arrived early. I stayed late. I noticed when the coffee ran low, when someone felt uncomfortable, and when plans needed fixing. I filled gaps without announcing I was there. Over time, that became my identity. The one who handled things so smoothly, no one remembered they needed handling at all. In family conversations, I was the listener. When I spoke, it was usually to support something already said. If my opinion aligned with the group, it was absorbed into the collective. If it didn't, it was gently ignored, like background noise that didn't quite interrupt the main track. No one was cruel about it. That's important to say. There were no sharp words, no obvious dismissals. It was softer than that, more efficient. My presence was acknowledged in ways that didn't require engagement. Dorothy's fine with whatever. She doesn't mind. You know Dorothy, she's flexible. Those sentences followed me everywhere. At first, I believed them too. I told myself I didn't need the spotlight, that I preferred peace over recognition. That being easygoing was a strength, not a surrender, and in many ways it was. I learned to read rooms, anticipate needs, and adapt quickly. I became competent in silence. But invisibility has a way of deepening when it's rewarded. Every time I smoothed something over, it reinforced the idea that I existed to make things smoother. Every time I stayed quiet to avoid tension, it taught others that tension simply didn't apply to me. My boundaries weren't crossed. They were never even registered. At family gatherings, I often ended up in transitional spaces. The kitchen, the hallway, the edge of the table. Not because anyone asked me to, but because that's where I was most useful. Plates needed clearing. Someone needed help finding something. There was always a small task waiting, and I stepped into it without thinking. My sister, meanwhile, sat, talked, was asked questions. Her stories were repeated by other people later, usually with added enthusiasm. Even when she talked about things I had helped with, my role dissolved into the background like it had never existed. And I let it, not because I lacked self-respect, but because I believed that consistency would eventually speak for itself. That people would notice patterns. That effort, over time, naturally earns recognition. What I didn't understand yet was this. When you consistently remove friction from other people's lives, they stop noticing your hands entirely. The comfort you create becomes the baseline. Anything less feels like absence. Anything more feels unnecessary. So that was who I was to them. Reliable, calm, invisible, not someone you checked in with deeply, not someone you worried about disappointing, not someone whose inner world required curiosity. I wasn't unseen, I was underseen, flattened into a role that worked too well to question. And the most dangerous part, I wore that role so convincingly that no one ever thought to ask if I wanted it. The first time it happened, I almost didn't register it as anything at all. That's how small it was. It wasn't public. It wasn't loud. It didn't stop the room or shift the mood. It slipped in quietly, dressed as something reasonable, something no one would argue over. That's why it stayed with me. It was months before my grandmother's birthday, during a smaller family dinner. Nothing special, no decorations, just food on the table and people talking over one another the way families do. I had spent the afternoon helping my grandmother prepare. She moved more slowly than she used to, and I'd learned how to match her pace without making her feel rushed. We cooked together, side by side. She told me stories I'd heard before, and I listened like they were new. By the time everyone arrived, the house smelled warm and familiar, the way it always had. When my sister walked in, the energy shifted slightly. Conversations paused. Someone greeted her loudly from across the room. She laughed and made a comment about traffic, about how busy she'd been, about how she barely had time to come. At dinner, my grandmother mentioned how helpful it had been having someone around today. She didn't say my name, but she smiled at me when she said it. Before I could respond, my sister picked up the thread. "Yeah," she said casually. "I've been trying to make more time for family lately. You know how hard that's been with everything going on." No one challenged it. No one clarified. The moment passed. Plates clinked. Someone asked for salt. I sat there, fork in a hand, feeling something tighten, not sharply, but enough to notice. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hurt. It was confusion. A quiet recalibration. I told myself I was overthinking it, that she hadn't meant to redirect credit, that people heard what they wanted to hear, that correcting the moment would have felt awkward, unnecessary, even petty. So I said nothing. That choice felt harmless at the time, even mature. Let it go. Keep the peace, it's not worth it. But something changed internally. Once you notice a small cut, you start noticing others like it. Not because they increase, but because your awareness sharpens. It's like realizing a room has a draft. You can't feel it until you do, and then you feel it every time the air shifts. After that dinner, similar moments surfaced more clearly. Comments about how my sister always stepped up, jokes about how she held the family together, stories retold with her name attached to efforts that had been shared, or sometimes, quietly, mine. Each time, the room stayed comfortable. No one looked uncomfortable. That was the point. Comfort was preserved at my expense, and I was the only one who felt the exchange. What made it harder wasn't that others ignored the truth. It was that the truth didn't disrupt anything enough to demand correction. Reality was being edited in small, socially acceptable ways, and I was complicit by staying silent. I didn't confront my sister. I didn't talk to anyone afterward. I folded the moment neatly inside myself and labeled it not important enough. But the body remembers what the mind minimizes. That first small cut didn't hurt because of what it took away. It hurt because of what it revealed, how easily my presence could be replaced in a story, and how little resistance that replacement met. No one meant to wound me, but no one noticed they had. And that, more than anything, is what lingered. After that first small cut, nothing changed on the surface. That's what made it easy to normalize. Life continued the way it always had. Family gatherings came and went. Birthdays, holidays, casual visits that blurred together over time. And in each of them, the pattern repeated, not aggressively, not even consciously, but consistently enough to reshape the landscape. I noticed how my sister's presence was narrated. If she arrived late, it was because she was busy doing important things. If I arrived early, it was because I liked helping. If she forgot something, it was understandable. If I remembered everything, it was expected. I became aware of how often my contributions were framed as personality traits rather than actions. She's just like that. She doesn't mind. That's Dorothy. Those phrases sound affectionate. They even feel affectionate. But they do something subtle. They strip effort of its weight. They turn choice into obligation. When my sister spoke passionately about something, people listened with interest. When I spoke calmly, people nodded and moved on. Not because my words lacked value, but because calmness didn't signal urgency. I wasn't competing for airtime, and no one felt the need to give it to me. I told myself that this was fine, that not everyone needed to be expressive, that families naturally have different roles, and this was simply mine. I rationalized my silence in practical ways. Speaking up would slow things down. Clarifying credit would make things awkward. Correcting narratives would feel defensive. I didn't want to seem sensitive. I didn't want to create tension over things that didn't really matter. So I adapted. I spoke less about what I did. I preemptively removed myself from moments where recognition might come up. I framed my own efforts as casual, minimal, no big deal, because that's how others already saw them. And aligning with that perception made interaction smoother. And smoothness became my currency. The more I normalized being overlooked, the more others learned that overlooking me carried no consequences. No discomfort, no friction, just continued access to my reliability. What surprised me was how quickly that normalization spread internally. I began to question my own reactions. Was I imagining things? Was I being unfair? Maybe my sister really did deserve more credit. Maybe my work really was easier than I thought. Maybe wanting acknowledgement was ego, not honesty. That's the quiet erosion of self-trust. When disrespect isn't loud, it doesn't trigger defenses. It settles in as doubt. You start managing yourself instead of the situation. You adjust your expectations downward and call it maturity. By the time my grandmother's birthday was being planned, this dynamic felt settled, predictable, almost invisible again. I was involved in the logistics, of course, coordinating schedules, helping with food, making sure accommodations were comfortable. My sister handled what everyone saw. The announcements, the conversations, the outward-facing warmth. No one assigned these roles. They simply reappeared, as they always did. And I didn't resist, because by then, staying quiet felt less like a decision and more like gravity. It pulled me into place without effort. What I didn't realize yet was that normalization doesn't mean acceptance. It means delay. It means something is being stored, not resolved. And stored things don't disappear. They wait. By the time my grandmother's birthday approached, I understood my role clearly, even if I'd never named it out loud. I was the reliable one, the buffer, the person who made sure things worked without needing credit for how they worked. I didn't sit at the center of conversations. I orbited them. Close enough to support, far enough to remain unnoticed. And everyone seemed comfortable with that. Family dynamics have a way of solidifying without discussion. No one ever says, "This is who you are to us now." It's implied through repetition, through who gets asked for opinions and who gets asked for help, through whose absence would be felt emotionally and whose absence would be felt logistically. Mine would have been the second. When plans were discussed, my sister was consulted. When plans needed execution, I was informed. If something went wrong, I fixed it quietly. If something went right, it belonged to the group, or more often to her. What made the role difficult wasn't the work itself. I didn't resent being capable. I didn't hate being dependable. What unsettled me was the expectation of emotional invisibility that came with it. No one asked how I felt about things. They assumed. And I let them, because correcting assumptions requires energy, and I had learned to conserve mine. At the birthday party, this role became unmistakable. I arrived early to help my grandmother get ready, adjusted chairs, helped with food, checked that everything was in place. When guests began arriving, I stepped back automatically, like someone exiting a stage they were never meant to stand on. My sister, meanwhile, moved easily into the center. She greeted people, took compliments, told stories. When someone thanked her for organizing things, she smiled and accepted it without hesitation. I watched this with a strange sense of calm, not numbness, clarity. This was the role I'd been practicing for years, and this was the role she'd been rewarded for. No one had stolen anything from me. That was the unsettling truth. I had handed it over, piece by piece, by never reclaiming it, by always being fine, by always making it easier for others to stay comfortable than to stay accurate. The realization didn't make me angry, it made me still, because roles only persist when they're maintained. And for the first time, I saw exactly how much effort I'd been putting into maintaining mine. As the party went on, compliments piled up around my sister. Stories about her generosity, her dedication, her presence. Some of them were true. Some were inflated, some were incomplete. I wasn't erased, I was edited out. And I understood then that if I continued to play this role, nothing would ever change. Not because anyone was malicious, but because the system worked. It benefited everyone except the person sustaining it. That understanding didn't push me toward confrontation. It pushed me toward choice. For the first time, I asked myself a question I'd never allowed before. What would happen if I stopped making this role so easy for everyone else? I didn't answer it yet, but I stopped pretending it didn't matter. The shift didn't happen during the party itself. It happened afterward, when the house was quiet again. Most of the guests had left. My grandmother was resting in her room, tired but happy. The decorations were half taken down, plates stacked neatly, leftovers wrapped and labeled. My sister had already gone, promising to call later. I stayed behind, as I usually did. I was wiping down the kitchen counter when my grandmother walked in slowly, leaning on the doorframe. She watched me for a moment before speaking. "You didn't sit much today," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. I smiled and shrugged. I didn't really need to. She nodded, but she didn't leave. Instead, she came closer and placed a hand over mine, stopping the cloth mid-motion. "You know," she said softly, "things go very smoothly when you're around." I felt something tighten again, but this time it wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Partial quiet, unshared recognition. She wasn't praising me loudly. She wasn't correcting anyone. She was simply naming what she saw. And for some reason, that was the moment everything inside me shifted, because I realized how little it took for the truth to exist. Just one person noticing, without needing to announce it. I didn't say much. I thanked her. She went back to her room, and I finished cleaning in silence. But my internal posture had changed. Up until then, I had believed that speaking up was the only alternative to being invisible. That if I didn't confront, I would remain unseen. That the choice was between noise and erasure. That night I understood something different. Visibility doesn't always come from volume. Sometimes it comes from alignment, from no longer distorting yourself to fit a role that benefits others more than it benefits you. I replayed the day in my mind, not with resentment, but with curiosity. I noticed how often I'd anticipated needs before they were voiced, how quickly I'd stepped in, how rarely I'd allowed anyone to feel the absence of my effort. That was the lever, not exposure, not an accusation, absence. I went home later than usual carrying that thought with me. I didn't make a plan. I didn't promise myself change. I just stopped dismissing the idea that my silence had been active, not passive. The shift wasn't visible yet, but it was permanent. After that night, I didn't suddenly behave differently. That's what made the change so powerful. From the outside, nothing shifted. I still showed up. I was still polite, still calm, still helpful when asked. But internally, my silence was no longer automatic. It was intentional. Before I had been quiet because it felt expected. Now I was quiet because I was observing. I stopped preemptively filling gaps. If something wasn't my responsibility, I let it remain unhandled until someone noticed. If a plan was vague, I didn't rush to clarify it. If credit drifted towards someone else, I didn't correct it, but I didn't reinforce it either. This wasn't punishment, it was neutrality. The difference is subtle, but it changes everything. When you stop compensating for other people's blind spots, those blind spots become visible. Not dramatically, not immediately, but inevitably. At first, no one noticed. They were used to the system working, used to me absorbing friction quietly, my silence still read as compliance. And that was fine, because I wasn't trying to be understood yet. I was trying to be accurate. I began documenting things for myself, not in a dramatic way, just notes, dates, who did what was said, what was assumed. It grounded me. It reminded me that my memory was not exaggerating, not rewriting the past to suit a feeling. This was especially important when doubt crept in, when I wondered if I was being unfair, when the old reflex to minimize returned. Facts don't argue, they simply exist. My sister continued as she always had. Confident, visible, assumed to be central. She didn't notice my internal shift because it didn't disrupt her experience yet. Others mistook my quietness for the same old thing. They didn't realize it had boundaries now. I was no longer disappearing. I was withholding unnecessary labor. That distinction mattered. The silence became spacious, not empty but intentional. A pause that allowed reality to breathe. And in that pause, patterns began to show themselves more clearly, to me first, and eventually to others. But I didn't rush the process. Quiet dominance doesn't announce itself. It waits. While nothing appeared to be happening on the surface, something was unfolding underneath. I'd always been observant. That wasn't new. What changed was what I observed and why. I began paying attention to systems instead of moments, patterns instead of personalities. I noticed how information flowed through the family, who people called first, who they assumed had answers, and who was trusted without being verified. I noticed how my sister's confidence filled gaps where facts were missing, and how my competence filled gaps without being seen at all. I also noticed how much institutional memory I carried. I knew where documents were kept. I knew schedules, preferences, and routines. I knew what had been promised to whom and when. I knew which details everyone else relied on without realizing it. I had always treated that knowledge as communal. Now, I treated it as neutral. I didn't hide anything, I simply stopped curating it for others. When questions arose, I answered precisely, no more, no less. When someone assumed I would handle something, I waited for the request. When plans were made without consulting me, I let them proceed without my silent corrections. This wasn't passive-aggressive, it was accurate. Meanwhile, I continued my own life quietly, strengthening my independence, making sure my finances were clear, ensuring my commitments were chosen, not inherited. These weren't reactions, they were preparations. I also began preserving context. When conversations happened that reframed events or reassigned credit, I didn't argue. I noted the language. Who said it? Who agreed? Who stayed silent? Over time, a picture emerged that was hard to ignore. Not of malice, of convenience. The family narrative had shaped itself around the person who spoke most confidently and the person who caused the least resistance. That wasn't personal. It was structural. And I was uniquely positioned to see it because I had lived on the load-bearing side of it. What they never noticed was that I had stopped internalizing their version of events. I no longer needed them to see me clearly in order to know where I stood. That clarity was stabilizing. It meant that when the next shift came, when leverage presented itself, I didn't hesitate or celebrate. I recognized it because I had been ready. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no discovery scene, no moment where everything suddenly clicked at once. It arrived the way most truths do, quietly, in pieces, through attention. It began with paperwork. My grandmother had asked me, casually, if I could help her organize some documents. Nothing urgent, just a preference for order. I agreed, the way I always had, and sat with her one afternoon going through folders that had been untouched for years. As we worked, I noticed patterns, notes in the margins, dates that didn't align with the stories I'd heard repeated so often. arrangements that had been verbally attributed to one person, but formally handled by another. Me, not just recently, for years. Medical appointments, financial check-ins, home maintenance decisions, things that required follow-through, not flair. Things that didn't show up in anecdotes but determined outcomes. The realization wasn't flattering. It was clarifying. The family's operational stability, especially around my grandmother, had quietly run through me. My sister had been visible. I had been essential. Essential roles don't need recognition to function. They need continuity. I didn't announce this to anyone. I didn't even discuss it with my grandmother in depth. She already knew, in her way. She trusted me because I had never asked her to prove why. The leverage wasn't controlled. It wasn't authority. It was context. I understood how things actually worked versus how they were described. And once you see that difference clearly, you can't unsee it. What mattered most was that nothing about this required action yet. I wasn't owed anything. I wasn't trying to correct history. I wasn't planning a reveal. I simply adjusted my internal map. If something needed to happen, I now knew exactly what my involvement changed and what it didn't. I understood where my absence would be felt and where it wouldn't. That knowledge was steadying. There was no rush, no satisfaction, just calm awareness. The truth didn't need attention, just space to exist. And I had finally given it that space, privately first. Knowing something and acting on it are very different experiences. For a while, I stayed in that in-between space, aware, steady, unprovoked. I let the knowledge settle, not as a weapon, but as a reference point. I watched how often my sister spoke about responsibility and how rarely she interacted with its details. I noticed how others deferred to her without checking facts, and how often those facts quietly landed back in my hands anyway. Nothing forced a decision yet, until one conversation did. It was an ordinary call, a family discussion about upcoming plans, spoken loosely, with a lot of assumptions folded into a few confident sentences. My sister outlined what we would do, what had already been handled, and what wouldn't be a problem. She mentioned my grandmother's needs as if they were abstract, manageable, already covered. They weren't. I listened carefully. I didn't interrupt. I waited to see if anyone else would ask questions. No one did. The plan moved forward on momentum alone. That was the moment I understood the cost of staying neutral. If I continued to quietly correct things behind the scenes, the narrative would stay intact. My sister would remain competent by association. The system would keep functioning, and I would keep carrying it. If I stepped in publicly, I would disrupt the story, but at the expense of peace and possibly trust. There was a third option. I could remove myself from responsibility without removing myself from the family. That option was irreversible. Once you stop being the quiet fail-safe, you can't go back without re-entering the role fully. Partial presence doesn't exist in systems like this. I didn't decide out of anger. I decided out of alignment. I clarified calmly what I was no longer able to handle. I didn't accuse. I didn't explain. I stated boundaries like logistics, not emotions. I won't be managing that. I can't commit to that going forward. You'll need to check directly. The responses were mild, polite, slightly confused. No one pushed back. They didn't understand yet that something had shifted permanently. But I did. And once the decision was made, there was no urge to defend it. Because I wasn't withdrawing to be seen. I was trying to be accurate. After the decision, I didn't announce anything. There was no family message, no clarification conversation, no explanation of my reasoning. I simply followed through, consistently, calmly, without commentary. That's what moving in silence looks like. When emails came that assumed my involvement, I redirected them. Briefly, neutrally. When plans referenced my support, I corrected the assumption once, and only once. I didn't remember. I didn't follow up. I let the system adjust, or fail to its new configuration. At the same time, I handled what was truly mine with precision. I formalized my own commitments, made sure agreements were written, not implied, ensured my grandmother's needs were documented clearly, with responsibilities assigned explicitly. Not to control anything, but to remove ambiguity. Ambiguity had always benefited the loudest voice. Clarity leveled the field. No one noticed at first. That was the pattern. They were used to things resolving themselves, used to resolve them quietly. So when small delays appeared, they were chalked up to miscommunication. When things weren't ready on time, it was considered a fluke. My sister continued to speak confidently, continued to assume, continued to reassure others that everything was handled. I didn't contradict her. I just didn't compensate. That's the part people misunderstand. Silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's containment. I contained my effort within the boundaries I had set, and slowly the consequences began to surface, not as conflict, but as friction. Appointments needed confirmation that no one had made. Questions were asked that no one could answer. Details emerged that required knowledge no one had bothered to acquire. Still, no one connected it to me, because quiet labor, once removed, doesn't announce its exit. It leaves a vacuum, and vacuums don't accuse. They wait. The first signs weren't dramatic. No one called an emergency meeting. No one admitted confusion. The consequences arrived the way they always do, in systems that rely on invisible labor, through inconvenience. A plan didn't quite come together. A detail was missed. Someone showed up assuming something had been arranged, only to realize it hadn't. Small things, individually explainable, collectively unfamiliar. At first, people laughed it off. Oh, we must have misunderstood. I thought someone else was handling that. We'll figure it out. They always had before. What changed was that this time, figuring it out required effort from people who weren't used to providing it. I watched from the same position I'd always occupied. Nearby, calm, unreactive. I didn't say this wouldn't have happened before. I didn't offer to fix anything. I simply stayed where I was, doing only what I had agreed to do. The discomfort was subtle but growing. My sister began checking her phone more often, asking clarifying questions she'd never needed to ask before. Her confidence didn't disappear, but it had to work harder. It had to fill gaps that used to close on their own. She didn't connect that change to me, not consciously. She just felt the strain. Others felt it too, though they couldn't name it. There was a slight tension in conversations, a new hesitation before assuming things were covered. For the first time, responsibility needed to be assigned out loud. That's when the system revealed itself. People started noticing how many things required follow-through, not just intention. How many decisions need memory? How many tasks need someone to quietly own them? And because I was no longer doing that work silently, the work became visible. Still, no one accused me of anything. No one blamed me. They didn't yet realize what had changed. They only felt that something reliable was missing. That's the moment people often rush in. To reassert value, to be helpful again, to restore equilibrium. I didn't, because restoring equilibrium would have meant restoring the old story. Instead, I let the consequences unfold at their natural pace, not to teach anyone a lesson, but to allow cause and effect to finally meet. Quiet dominance doesn't correct others. It steps aside and lets reality speak. By the time everyone realized something was wrong, they were already reacting to outcomes, not causes. That's always how it happens. Plans started unraveling in ways that couldn't be smoothed over quickly. Things that required continuity, knowledge built over time, not just enthusiasm, began to strain. Questions piled up. Follow-ups were missed. Small errors compounded into visible stress. And still, no one looked directly at me. Instead, there was a growing sense of urgency. My sister became more animated, more insistent, trying to regain control through presence alone. She reassured people repeatedly that she had things handled, even as evidence suggested otherwise. I didn't contradict her. I didn't rescue her either. Others began to feel the pressure. Not anger yet, confusion, frustration, a subtle panic that things weren't as simple as they had always seemed. That's when the tone shifted. Conversations became more pointed. Responsibilities were questioned. People asked each other what had changed, but the question was always abstract, never personal. No one wanted to confront the possibility that the system had relied too heavily on someone who never demanded acknowledgement. By the time anyone considered looping me back in, it was already too late to fix things the old way. The momentum had shifted. I was no longer positioned as the default solution. I had removed myself cleanly, without complaint, without drama. There was nothing to argue against. That's the paradox of quiet withdrawal. When done without resentment, it leaves no hook for negotiation. No guilt to leverage, no conflict to resolve. I wasn't refusing. I was simply no longer available in the way I once had been. The discomfort in the room was real now. Not explosive, but undeniable. And for the first time, people had to sit with the consequences of assumptions they'd never examined. Still, I stayed calm. because nothing I had done was sudden. They were only just noticing. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. It happened in a quiet moment, not a public one. No raised voices, no audience, just my sister and me, standing in the same kitchen where I'd spent years making things easier. She didn't accuse me. She didn't apologize either. She looked tired. "I feel like things have been harder lately," she said, "and I don't really understand why." I nodded, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. There was a pause. She was waiting for me to fill it, to explain, to reassure, to smooth things over like I always had. I didn't. "I'm not managing the same things anymore," I said calmly. "That's all." She frowned slightly. "Since when?" "Since I realized I didn't actually agree to most of it. That was the extent of it. No list of grievances, no emotional inventory, no revisiting the past. Just a statement of present reality." She tried, briefly, to reframe it, to suggest it was a misunderstanding, to imply that things had always worked this way because they made sense. I listened. Then I said evenly, "They worked because I made them work." The room went quiet. Not heavy, just clear. I didn't say it with bitterness. I didn't say it to win. I said it because it was true, and because I no longer needed her to accept it in order to act on it. She didn't respond right away. She didn't argue. She didn't fully understand. But something shifted in her expression. A recalibration. The first time she had to consider that the story she'd been living inside wasn't complete. We didn't resolve anything that day. We didn't need to. The confrontation wasn't about agreement. It was about boundary recognition. And boundaries don't require consensus. They require consistency. I didn't become louder after that. I didn't reinvent myself or claim a new role in the family. I didn't demand recognition for the past or restructure relationships through force. What changed was simpler and more lasting. I became precise. I say yes when I mean yes. I say no without explanation when no is the honest answer. I no longer anticipate needs that haven't been expressed, and I no longer volunteer myself as the solution to unspoken problems. Some people found this adjustment uncomfortable. Others barely noticed. That, too, was information. My sister and I settled into a different rhythm, less performative, more defined. She still occupies space easily. I no longer shrink to make that possible. There's no bitterness between us, no ongoing tension, just a clearer understanding of where one person ends and the other begins. As for me, I'm still calm, still observant, still capable, but I'm no longer invisible. Not because people finally see me, but because I no longer disappear. The quiet dominance I carry now isn't about control. It's about alignment. My actions match my values. My energy is spent intentionally. My presence has weight because it's no longer automatic. And the most surprising part? Life feels lighter this way. Not easier, but cleaner. Because when you stop managing other people's perceptions, you gain room to exist fully in your own reality. That space is enough. There's a particular kind of relief that comes not from being understood, but from no longer needing to be. For a long time, I thought justice had to be loud to be real. That truth required witnesses. That if something mattered, it had to be spoken, defended, and validated in real time. What this experience taught me is something quieter and more enduring. The truth doesn't need attention, just space to exist. When I stopped compressing myself to maintain harmony, nothing exploded. No one was publicly shamed. No relationships were destroyed. What changed instead was the shape of responsibility, the flow of effort, the accuracy of expectations. People eventually adjusted, not because they were corrected, but because reality made certain assumptions unsustainable. That's the moral I carry forward. If you are consistently overlooked, it doesn't always mean you need to speak louder. Sometimes it means you need to stop holding the structure together silently. Sometimes it means letting the absence of your effort reveal its value. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about choosing not to lose yourself in roles you never agreed to play. I don't regret my patience. It taught me discernment, but I also don't regret stepping back. It taught me self-respect. Both can coexist. So if you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in parts of my story, if you've been the reliable one, the invisible one, the person everyone assumes will be fine, I want to leave you with this question. What would happen if you gave the truth in your life just a little more space and stopped rushing in to make things comfortable for everyone else? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.